As you probably know, lenses are a super important part of photography, perhaps even more important than which camera body we decide to use. They can also be super expensive, especially if you add up the total cost of all your lenses combined. Plus, there's so many different options. We've got wide lenses, zoom lenses, tele lenses, macro lenses, tilt shift lenses, so many different options. It can all get a bit confusing, especially if you're new to photography. So which lenses should you buy and why? Of course, the answer will vary a little bit depending on what style of photography you mostly shoot. But with that in mind, I'm going to give as much information as possible to make this decision much easier for your next lens purchase. To help me out here, I have looked through my massive Lightroom catalog and actually filtered through each of the lenses I own to see how many shots I've taken on each of those lenses. Also answer the question of why I reach for different lenses, so you can decide on which one may benefit you the most and the style of photography you're choosing to shoot. So when deciding on which lenses you should buy next, I'm going to look at 3 main questions you need to answer. The first one is, what style of photography do you mostly shoot? The second one is, how much are you actually going to use this particular lens? And the third one is, what is your budget? This will also often determine the quality of the lens. So before jumping in to help you answer these 3 simple questions, we do need to understand 2 features of absolutely every lens that are important to know. That of course is the focal length and the maximum or widest aperture of any particular lens. These are always represented in the name, so they're easy to find. So firstly, looking at focal length, this is the angle of view or the magnification, essentially how wide or zoomed in the photo will be. Here I've moved my camera further back to show you some examples. As the focal length goes up, you can see the change in perspective, but also the compression in the image. So in this video, all the focal lengths I am referring to are on full frame systems. However, if you are using a crop sensor, you'll just have to go in and make those simple calculations yourself so you can work out the equivalent lens. For focal length, we can break it down into 2 main types of lenses. We've got zoom lenses, which cover a range of focal lengths. For example, 24 to 70 millimeters covers that entire range from 24 to 70, or a prime lens like a 35 millimeter prime, for example, which is stuck at one focal length. So if you're new to photography, a fair question to ask would be, why on earth would you use a prime lens when you can use a zoom lens to cover a larger range of focal lengths rather than just being stuck at one point? Well, the answer is actually quite simple, and it largely comes down to lens mechanics. Prime lenses typically allow you to shoot at a much larger or wider aperture, which lets more light in and gives you more depth of field. So as handy as zoom lenses can be, often a lot of people, myself included, often reach for prime lenses a lot more frequently, especially when you want a little bit more depth of field. So that brings me to the second thing we need to talk about, which of course is the maximum aperture of a lens. The largest aperture of any particular lens will be represented by its f-stop, e.g. f2.8 or f1.8, etc, etc. A bit confusing here, but remember, the lower the number, the larger or the wider the aperture. So f1.8 is a larger or wider aperture than 2.8, and this will give you more depth of field or more blurriness or separation from your subject and background, often called bokeh. Wider aperture can often mean more expensive as well, but if you do love depth in your photos, it can be well worth it. Lenses can last a really long time, and typically they hold their value pretty well. An example here, 250mm RF Canon lenses. We've got one that's f1.2 and one that's f1.8. One is actually about 10 times the price of the other. You can see it is considerably bigger as well. So always keeping these 2 things in mind, aperture and focal length, we can go on and answer those 3 questions, which will decide which lenses to buy. So question 1, what are you shooting, or what is your main subject going to be? This will help determine what focal length you want to be shooting at. It will also help determine what maximum aperture you want your lens to be capable of. So here's a quick rundown of different focal lengths and the purposes they are commonly used for. Starting with super wide lenses like your fisheye lenses, these are typically wider than 14mm, and these are mostly used for more abstract, creative. They're not overly common, so I'm going to move on to the next one. Now our wide angle lenses, these are quite common. This is anywhere from about 14mm up to 35mm. These are very common for landscape photography, things like architecture, some portraits from kind of about 24mm usually, sometimes a little bit wider even. Wide lenses are also really useful for things like vlogging and used a lot for your wide angle shots in video. So moving on to more of our standard focal lengths, anywhere from about 35 to 85. Between this range is a little bit more natural for our eyes and for people's faces, so generally most portraits are shot within this range. They are also really common for things like street and travel photography, especially because a lot of photojournalism is typically at 35mm. They're also really common with things like events and weddings, and also fashion photography. If we move on a little bit more to our short tele lenses, that's anywhere from about 85 to 135mm. This is still pretty common for street and portraits, giving you a little bit more compression on those shots. And again, it's pretty common at things like events and weddings. Anything up and above over 200, you're looking more at sports, wildlife, and action. Anything longer than that, again, we continue to look at those same things, and even things like astronomy. And then your last category, which I threw in there, is your macro lenses, which can cover a range of focal lengths, but its purpose is a little bit different. It's to focus on a subject really close to your camera. So next up, considering aperture. And I've broke this down into kind of two different categories. One, your super wide apertures, and that's anywhere from say f1.2 to f2.8. When we're looking at these wider apertures, they become a lot more important for things like portrait photography, creating a nice depth of field. For me, I really like using these wider apertures for street photography as well. Personally, I really like having that depth in my street photos, especially if you're shooting street at night and you need to be able to shoot at a higher shutter speed. Having a wider aperture will really help with this. So any night photography, to let more light in, it will allow you to shoot with a faster shutter speed. So this is why we often refer to lenses with a large aperture as fast or a bit faster, because they allow you to shoot with a faster shutter speed. The last one is things like astrophotography, where again, you need to let a lot more light in to be able to capture those images. Having a wider aperture is really important. Things that it can be slightly less important for are things like landscape photography, some parts of fashion photography, because you want most of the image, you want most of the garment or the landscape in focus, so you don't typically need or want a really wide aperture. So when considering the maximum aperture of any lens, you want to consider two things. Do you want to create a lot of depth of field in your photos, have that separation between the subject and the background, or do you want to shoot in really low light conditions? If the answer is yes to either of those questions, or both, I would highly recommend looking at a lens, say anywhere from f1.2 up to about f2.8 as its maximum aperture. So question 2, how much use are you actually going to get out of this lens that you're thinking of buying? This graph you're looking at has the number of photos I've taken with different lenses over the past maybe 5 years or so. Now for me, this data is a little bit skewed because I shoot a lot of time lapses. Over 90% of my time lapses were shot on these two widest lenses I have on the left here. So you can largely ignore those two. But one thing to consider, if you do mostly shoot landscape, architecture, wide cityscapes, things like that, then these two ranges are really likely to be your most used lenses, and you're also not going to need a really wide aperture in most of those situations. You can see I do use the 50mm a lot. For me, it's a great versatile focal length. It's really great for general street photography, and I also reach for this lens all the time at weddings and also for portraits. Of note, I didn't include 85 prime here because I haven't owned one until recently. This is also a super common portrait lens. For me, my 135 prime and also my 70-200 are mostly used at events more recently, but I also love these for street photography. I just really like the compression at these focal lengths. So if we look at one more graph, I'm going to show you which lenses I've used most within, say, the last 18 months or since I bought the Canon R5. Here again, you can see the 50mm I've used a lot. It is probably my favorite lens. 85 I've added into this graph. This is actually mostly from borrowing an 85 when I shoot weddings. So based on this, if I was rebuying all these lenses myself, I would probably largely stick to this order. I would buy a 24 to 70 2.8 first, then a 50mm prime, then either a wide angle zoom if I was shooting more landscape, or a 35mm prime if I was shooting more portraits. And then I would get both the 85 and then the 135 prime, and maybe then a 70-200. So hopefully that information helps you on what lenses you're likely to use. Of course, the very last question is, what is your budget? If you're just starting out in photography and you're really not sure how much you're actually going to enjoy it yet, probably start out a little bit before you spend too much on lenses. Get a feel for it, see if you really like it or not. Once you know you really like it and you want to invest and you know you're going to spend a lot of time doing it in the future, that's when you can start investing a little bit more money in some good lenses that are going to last you a long time. So when you know what focal length and aperture of lenses you want to buy, you can start to look at a few other things that come into budget as well. Image quality, build quality, weather sealing, all these things can go into the price as well. Once you've decided on what type of lens you want to buy, you can go in and compare reviews and data on similar lenses to make that final decision a bit easier. All right, I've been talking for way too long now, so if you do have any more questions, let me know in the comments. Hope you found this video useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to support the channel. I would really appreciate it. Remember, keep creating, keep growing. I'm TKNORTH. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye for now.